Welcome back to the 10 Adventures podcast. How would your life change if you had a rare brain disease? What would you do more of, and what would you do less of? Today, we'll find out as we talk with Crystal Gail, who found the healing power of hiking after having brain surgery. Hi, Crystal. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Richard. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
I'm excited to have you on here. You've done some incredible trails that I want to learn more of. But before we talk about that, I think your story of going through serious health issues and coming out stronger than ever is so powerful. Can you maybe share a bit about your life leading up to your brain surgery and then, what happened afterwards?
Prior to brain surgery, I feel like I was like a typical person, I would do the things that people enjoy, or things that I personally enjoyed. I would hang out with friends. I would like read books, go to movies, nothing too athletic. At that time, I had started medication, and the medication caused me to gain a lot of weight. So in terms of physical activity, there wasn't a whole lot that I was doing that was physical. In terms of the outdoors, I think a lot about growing up where my parents would tell me go outside, don't come back in until the lights go off, right? So all our neighborhood kids were just hanging out, so we would do things like ride our bikes with the kids around the neighborhood. And for outside, I would say that that was the extent, though the best time I ever had outside was we would have two neighborhoods, and what divided us was undeveloped property, but it was kind of like the woods. And so we would play manhunt with one neighborhood against the other neighborhood. So when we met, we would meet in the woods to play, and it's kind of like capture the flag. But I always found that I would climb trees to go high, because then I could see everyone. And then I would know when my team was captured or the other team was captured, and then I would come down. So it was trees were kind of my thing. I just hadn't fully connected why or where that came from. But I think that that was my first true experience outdoors, was just play. So playing outdoors, but not really connecting with nature, not really appreciating what was there. I was more appreciative of the games we were playing and the people that I was playing against.
It's funny you mentioned just playing with the neighborhood kids because that's what I remembered as talking to a friend of mine recently. And I never see kids playing out. And we'd have after school, all the kids on our street would come out and we'd run around and we'd play kind of similar games with a little park near our street. And I don't know what's happening. Like what my friend said, his kids are older, is kids just connect online and they play vids together and stuff. But I feel like they're missing something just running around in fields and forests and undeveloped land. Do you see kids still playing where you are now, or is that something that's not just here in Western Canada? It's all over North America.
Yeah, so I actually had the privilege of working at a forest school. So I
Oh
was a
wow.
forest school teacher. So with the exception of English, though sometimes English language arts, we would be outside. So math took place outside. Sometimes literacy took place outside. But most of our activities were outside, using the land as a teaching tool. So that was last year. And so I got to see the importance of play outdoors, but then also to connecting with nature in an outdoor space as a learning tool. And so I have seen, that aspect of kids being outdoors, but now I work more at a traditional school. And so the kids go outside for recess, and it's that's what, 40 minutes a day? That just feels like it's too much. And then they're bussed into school, and it's just a lot. So I don't really see many people playing outdoors, or young people playing outdoors. And that's disappointing to me.
Yeah, yeah, I feel like we're losing something without kids just exploring outdoors. Um, so your life was going along, you're having a great life, and then all of a sudden you have this brain issue. And,
Right.
as you're dealing with this lead up to surgery, like, how does something that traumatic impact you?
So I wasn't fully aware of the condition at the time. Like I said, I was overweight and doctors would tell me like, "Oh, you need to lose weight, you're going to get health issues." And I'm like, "Okay, yeah, I'm trying." Like I'm not like just sitting here. So I kept having problems with, like, my vision, and so I was like, "Oh, like, I need new glasses." Doctors were telling me, like, "You're pre-diabetic, and maybe that's why you're having eye issues." But then I was like, "You know what? I really think I need new glasses, and that'll solve everything." So when I went to the eye doctor was like, "You need to go to neuro-ophthalmology." And I'm like, "What? Like, my vision's that bad?" And he's like, "No, we're gonna take you to neuro op, but we're taking you in an ambulance." And I'm like, doesn't make sense to me. And as soon as I went to the hospital, the doctor let me know that I had a rare brain disease and she needed to operate. And I was like, but I just need new glasses. Like, I don't know why we're operating here. Are you doing my eyes? Like, what are you doing? And she installed a shunt. Like, it's a machine. It's actually made for kids that so my condition is I have intracranial hypertension, or sometimes called pseudo pseudotumor cerebri. Um, Pseudotumor cerebri, it's where your body thinks and acts like you have a brain tumor, but you don't actually have one. And so the way that it reacts is by putting too much spinal fluid throughout your body. So essentially, you're drowning your brain with fluid. And so I had a shunt put in, and the shunt drains the fluid so that when it gets too high, it drains, because there's not anything actually, you don't have a brain tumor. Your body just thinks that way. Your body just acts that way. So the shunt helps to reduce the fluid. So then your body is supposed to regulate to become norm. Shunts are generally made for kids. They're not used for adults. They're for kids with hydrocephalus, and they're not really made for adults. And so when I had that first shunt installed, it was like in a series of just like shunt surgeries after shunt surgeries just to get new shunts because, again, they weren't really designed for adults.
And then once you had that, what I was really interested is you all of a sudden started to become super active and started bringing on these outdoor pursuits. Can you maybe talk a little bit about kinda how your life changed after these, first implants?
Yeah. So my life didn't necessarily change with the implant of the shunts. What happened was I got sick of the shunts because they were always breaking. And so I finally got a neurosurgeon who I was able to talk to him and let him know that, hey, I want to live a healthy lifestyle. These shunts, they're not working for me, and I want you to remove them. And he was the first neurosurgeon that was like, yeah, I'll remove them. You might have to come in for spinal taps every 6 months or so. But what started to happen after that, when the shunts were removed, was I was having really bad headaches. And so I went back to this neurosurgeon and I'm explaining to him what I'm experiencing. And he said, "Hey, I want to try you with this device." The device is called a neuromodulator. He was like, "It will either help you or it won't." And I was like, "Well, either way, like it's a 50-50 chance. Like I'm already sick. So why not?" So I tried it, and that's when I became more like I got the neuro implant or the neuromodulator, and, like, as soon as I woke up from surgery, I'm, like, walking the halls, like, trying to, like, move around the halls, and, the nurses were like, "Yo, you just had brain surgery, you need to go lay down." And I'm like, "No, I wanna move around." And so they ended up, like, putting me in a bed that had an alarm on it, so anytime I got out of bed, the alarm would go off and a nurse would come in. So, I just I just felt like this new sense of I can do anything. And so after I got the neuromodulator, um, that's when I was like, "Oh, I need to start running." And so part of me running was like in in high school, I'd ran cross country. So I was like, oh, I want to be a runner again. So after the implant surgery, like 6 weeks later, I ran my first half marathon, and it was like, okay. And so, after that first half marathon is when I actually started to get big into outdoor pursuits.
I love the story of your first, hike. Can you maybe share, going out to the nature preserve near Atlanta?
Yeah, so it was after that first half marathon, I had a friend who he's really into outdoor backpacking and not really outdoor backpacking. He's more into like camping and like he does like hammocks and doesn't matter. He's really into nature. And so he says to me, I want to take you to this nature preserve so that you can cool down. And I'm like, that's dumb. There are bugs. Why would I go? Like, that doesn't sound good to me. Can we just do anything else? So we ended up going to this nature preserve and we go down to a creek and there was this tree and I just felt like so connected to this tree. And so going to that tree, I was like, oh, I want to hug this tree. So I'm hugging the tree and I'm like, this feels so good. Like I had this sense that me and the tree were connected in that like I was breathing oxygen that it provided. It was like a reciprocal thing. So it was like, you're giving me energy, I'm giving you energy. Together, this is how I think humans are meant to be, to like exist in nature. And so I say to my friend, hey, I'm gonna go backpack. And he was like, well, what do you mean? And I'm like, no, I heard about a trail. And in my head, I was thinking of the Oregon Trail because the game you used to
Yeah, yeah,
play.
yeah.
So I was like, yeah, it's out west somewhere, and that's where I'm gonna go. And he was like, so you're just gonna be a backpacker? And I'm like, no, I'm gonna do the whole trail. And he was like, okay. So then when I got home, um, I like started Googling and I'm like, oh, this trail is longer than I thought. And then, oh, this trail is not just an Oregon and it's not the Oregon Trail, it was the PCT. So, like after that half marathon was in October. The following year in April is when I headed out on the PCT to hike the PCT.
That's wild that, everything happened so quick for you. What was it like, getting on the PCT as someone who had done almost had you done any backpacking? Your first day of the PCT, was that your first time actually, like, backpacking, or you done a couple things down in the Southeast where it was warm?
No, that was I did, like I call it a shakedown hikers do, where they, like, figure out what gear they're gonna use or whatever. So, I went to Fort Mountain, State Park here in Georgia. I'm in Georgia right now, here in Georgia, and there I was like, "Oh, yeah, I'm totally prepped for this trip." I wasn't at all, and I had only hiked, like, 2 miles to get to the campsite, and when I got to the campsite, I was like I'd brought things like tuna in a can. I didn't have a can opener. Like, I was like, "I don't know how to start a fire. It's cold." There were, like, so many mishaps. So, being on the PCT, my longest hike to date was the first day of the PCT. I hiked 20 miles and was like, "What the heck?" Like, 1, this is a lot, and 2, this is a long trail, and 3, I am so not prepared. And so I think a lot of hikers on the PCT, there's a town, the first town you get to, it's called Mount Laguna, and there, it's like a little small shop, like a gear shop, where most hikers trade out their gear. So there I was like, "Well, I need lighter this, this, and this." So I picked out new gear, and then from there, I felt a little bit more prepared, and yeah, those first 600 miles are like that time being on the PCT, like, opened my eyes to so many things and, like, changed who I was, like, at my core, if that makes sense.
Yeah, how do you feel it changed you?
So when hiking, I felt more regulated in my body, and I felt more, like, at peace. And so in my head, and I think that maybe a few hikers have done this where I was like, oh my gosh, this should be for everyone. Everyone should come out here because you know what? I'm now, thoughts go, I'm now gonna start bringing people out here for therapy because I feel like if people just come outdoors for therapy, like the world would be a better place. And hikers would say to me, that already exists. And I'm like, no, 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 no. I'm gonna do therapy, like make people go backpacking. Like that's gonna be the therapy. And people were like, that already exists. And I'm like, but it doesn't, not this. And so, since so many people told me that it already existed, I was like, you know what? It probably does. And so, I started researching that once I finished the 600 miles and then realized, yes, it was a thing. And I went back to college to get a degree in that adventure-based psychotherapy and adventure education. It's a master's interdisciplinary studies.
Why do you think backpacking or just spending extended periods in nature has this transformative effect? Because, like I've always said, if I can get someone into the backcountry for a week, it's going to change their life. But I always struggle. It's like, how is it going to change their life? Like, I feel like life just gets a bit easier, and then it's just you just feel incredible. But that's just my kind of thinking. Like, how do you see going backpacking on the PCT or really anywhere changing people?
So I will say for me, it was a lot of like self-reliance. So I got more confidence in who I was, like as a Black woman showing up in spaces. Like I felt like I didn't have to rely on anyone. I didn't have access to internet. So I wasn't being fed the ideas that like social media plays in our lives. I didn't have access to that. So it was just all me thinking. I relied on myself. I like my sleep was better because I was aligned with nature. So like the sun rose, I rose. Sunset, I went to sleep. So it was like everything just became so much clearer and better. And I just feel like that's more of a natural space or a natural place to be. Like just being in nature is something that it's freeing, it's peaceful, and you really learn to like you learn what you don't need in life. So like just carrying around my tent, my sleeping bag, everything that I needed to survive on my back made me realize like we don't need as much stuff as we have. Like here I am surviving for weeks just with a backpack, you know? So having that freedom of not being tied down to material things, not being weighted by media or like influences from outside people. I felt like that was something that hiking provided.
It's funny you mentioned about like just the sunrise and sunset. And there is probably, I've never thought of that, but I've always felt it's like it just feels right. But you're right. It's dark, go to bed, sleep all
Mhm.
night, it's light, wake up. And there's, walk around all day for, centuries, for thousands of years. That's what we've done as humans. And then it's the last 100 years, it's like, doesn't matter what it is. You're waking up at 6:30, you're gonna get in your car and commute, and you're gonna sit at a desk all day. And that's probably some aspect of as humans, we're designed to roam around and, deal with the seasons and whatnot. I haven't thought of that, but I love that insight. Um, I also read an article, and you have a phrase, "I can, I must, I will." And I'm interested, what does that mean for you, and how does it influence how you approach your life?
Yeah. So after one of my brain surgeries, I had to move back home with my parents. And I would just like lay in bed. And when my parents got home from work, what did you do today? Nothing. Like I just rested or I read a book or I didn't really go outside, there was nothing, and so my dad started to every morning, he would come into my room and he would say, "Repeat after me. I can, I must, I will," and I would repeat it, and then he would make me get in the car with him, and then he would drive me to the front of our housing division, which was like a mile from our house, and so he would make me walk home. So he was like, "You're gonna walk home. It's the only way you're gonna get home is if you walked." And so I was like, okay, yeah, I guess I'm walking. And so I would walk, and what was halfway between my parents' house and the subdivision, there was a park. So that's where I went to rest because at that time I wasn't really in good shape and I needed to rest at that half mile. So, like, I would walk and then go rest in the park. And so I found that being in the park and not being in bed like, made me feel better. I hadn't fully connected it that it was, like, me being outside. I just thought it was like, "Oh, the park, it's not the home, it's not with the 4 walls, so it's something different." I did not connect it to, "You're in a natural space, and this is why this feels good." And so every morning, I can, I must, I will, and I continue that even now, where it's like, I can do anything, I will do anything, and I must do everything.
One of the, challenges of having your brain implant is it limits the weight you can carry, which is also, I think, maybe a good thing. We had Glenn Van Pesky on our podcast, and he wrote a book, Take Less, Do More, and, definitely made me question everything I need in my bag. I'm interested, you have to be really ruthless in what you carry. What are some of the big ways you've changed your backpack to carry less that other people should consider?
Um, so Glenn is a friend of mine, so it's interesting that you mentioned Glenn. So things that I carry, like I don't have my luxury item or the one item that I cannot or feel like I can't live without is my tent. So my tent is like 2.5 pounds. And so what I like about the tent, it's a sling fin portal. So it has two sides. So it's like, you can sleep on either side because I don't like wet things or I don't like sweaty things. So I would just hang them on the other side throughout the night because everything would dry. And I'm like, yay, look how things dried because I have this other side of the tent. And then also, too, from a safety perspective, being in a bigger tent is like better for me because then I'm easier to find if anything happens. Um, in terms of weight, I tend to reduce weight by, um, not carrying as much food. So, people speak a lot about hiker hunger and, like, "I'm gonna die because I don't have enough food," and I'm like, "Well, good for you." Like, don't die, and then also too, don't die, but then also recognize that what your body is telling you it needs is not what you actually like, you don't need all this sugar. Your body's telling you need to eat. It's not saying, "Eat a lot of sugar." Like, so carrying less sweet things was really, really hard. The only sweet thing I carry is brown sugar because I put on everything to make it sweet. So food, I don't carry, um, like, as many clothes as most people. So, like, at the end of the night, I have a pair of long johns, and that's what I change into. Like, I don't like, of course, I, like, take off the shirt, but usually I'll sleep in, like, my jacket instead of the shirt that I've been wearing. And so some hikers will switch between the nighttime into other clothes. I don't. And I don't carry as many electronic things because I also have to carry, the programmer for my implant, and so that takes away weight. Sounds silly, but, on the PCT, I stopped carrying a first aid kit, and the moment that I stopped carrying it, I, of course, cut my finger, and I was like, "Oh, yeah, I have no first aid kit whatsoever," and so I ended up going to the first clinic that I could hike to. It took me 2 days, and the guy was like, "Your hand's infected," and I'm like, "Yeah, probably." And so he had to, like, cut it back open in order to stitch it, and then he gave me antibiotics and was like, "You really need to carry a first aid kit," and I'm like, "You're right." So for that, I just carry, cayenne pepper. So, like, if I get a cut, I just put it on there and then hope that I get to another town soon. So, yeah.
I like how you talked a bit about the food because one of the big things I've worked on, I used to come back from every backpacking trip with like 3 more days of food, and we go it's my wife and I and 3 kids. I carry all the food, so I have, like, 3 days of food for 5 people. It could be, like, a third of my bag, and now when I come back, I always have a little bit, but it's, like, so rewarding not to have an entire food bag, and it's just this idea of, like, okay, the worst case, I'm kind of a day from a road. If we run out of food or something happens, I don't need to have 3 days of food, and there's a bunch of little things like that where if you just kinda think, "What do I need?" It can really, really change your outlook. You've hiked some of the greatest trails in the US, such as the PCT, the John Muir Trail in California, the Superior Hiking Trail, the Arizona Trail, part of the Great Western Loop. You know, some of those are famously difficult, but you say the Florida Trail is the most challenging, which was surprising. I don't know a ton about the Florida Trail. Can you maybe share a bit about it and why it was so tough?
Hmm. So the the Florida Trail, it's kind of like almost a choose your own adventure. You all start Most people start in the swamp. And so you start in the swamp and then you're hiking north. But then you have the opportunity to go east towards Orlando or west towards Tampa. So once you do that, you split up, you go up, and then you go north again. And then you have the opportunity to, at the end, go to the beach or go towards Alabama. So it's like two choices. So depending on which choice you make will depend on how long your trail is. So I did the shorter route and um, went towards Orlando. Oh, there's also Lake Okeechobee, which you get to choose east or west. Um, the Florida Trail for me, what I think was most challenging, first I came from my home in Minnesota. So I had went to Florida, like we had a blizzard, so I couldn't start on the day that I was anticipating starting. So it was like I got a late start, and then when I got picked up from the airport, like, I believe my plane was late, doesn't matter. I got to the trail at, like, 3 or 4, and it was like, "Okay, time to start," and I was, like, freaking out because a lot of people are like, "The swamp, that's where everybody turns around at," and I'm like, "Oh god." So, you hike 3 miles before you hit the swamp, and then the swamp is 30 miles, so you're just walking in water for 30 miles. So, when I hit the swamp, it was almost nighttime, and I was like, "Oh, yeah, this is where I'm gonna die at." And then right when I'm in the swamp, there's another hiker who is walking back, and I'm like, "Oh, are you finishing?" And she was like, "No, I'm getting off." And I'm like, "Okay, like, you look like a really, like, built hiker. This is scary." And so the first night was when I realized that there were snakes in the water, and I was like, "Okay, yeah, that's something that I hadn't really like." For me, I feel like most animals in nature, you can say, "Hi, like, I'm not a threat." I show you that I'm not a threat by not coming close to you. I'm not bothering you, I'm not bothering your land, I'm just here hiking. So I feel like there's a connection that I can make with animals to let them know that, like, I'm a safe person with no interest in bothering you, just let me pass. But with snakes in the water, it's like, "Oh, yeah, I have no reason to be in the water. I have no ability to tell you that I'm not a threat because here I am walking through, splashing your home. I don't really know where you live. I feel bad about this and I need to go." So that first night, we saw another hiker had joined me. He was very kind to wait for me. Um, I cannot remember his name. We only hiked together for 2 days, just to get through the swamp, and we saw water moccasins, and I think they're called pythons, I'm not sure, but they were water snakes, and I was afraid, and I'm like, "Hey, I'm not gonna keep hiking in the dark even with my headlamp. That's just not safe. I'm getting out." And then plus, there are gators, and I learned that gators I learned this, like, after I made it through the swamp. I recognized that gators weren't a threat to me. Like, as long as I didn't bother them, they were, like, chilling. I'm not in their food category, right? They will only attack me when they can't see me, because gators are almost blind, so as long as I hike during hours that make sense and I don't bother them, then we're all good. So I really enjoyed the swamps on the Florida Trail. What I didn't like about the Florida Trail is how isolated it was. So, like, I could hike for a few days and never see another hiker, or I would be hiking and then be on the road because the Florida Trail has like straight up road walks, like hundreds of miles of just walking on roads. And for me, that was brutal. Like, I was like, oh, this is hard. And people are like, are you hitchhiking? Like, what are you doing? Why are you here? Like, sort of like that. So that part was hard. And I think for me, isolation, not having people around to just to recognize, like, I'm not alone out here. That was the difficult part for me. It wasn't necessarily like the trail was brutal, but it wasn't necessarily like the trail itself. It was the lack of people. So that was hard for me, but I did enjoy the Florida Trail. Like, in hindsight, there were things that I enjoyed, like hiking through the various um, ecosystems. And because, like, it was snowing in South Florida when I got on, and I'm like, what the hell? And so it was just like a series of just like going through everything, and I loved that, and I grew up in Florida, so walking the state that I grew up in was, like, strange to me because I'd never been to most of those places. I never knew that there was a trail there, so it was, like, eye-opening for me, but it's still ranked pretty low on trails that yeah.
It's wild how hard it is to do some of these walks alone and, going a few days in the Rockies or I did a trip in the Pyrenees in 2002 when no one traveled because it was just after September the 11th, and I was the only guy staying in hostels some night, or I was camping as well. And after 5 or 6 days where you don't see anybody, it's weird, like, you just think, "Why am I so" like, I remember crying coming into a town, and I still think, like, "Why was I so emotional?" But there is something when you're not around others and you're on your own and you're in unfamiliar environments, like, often it's the psychological aspect that makes it really hard, and then conversely, you can be doing really hard days, but if you have people around who can make you laugh, who can tell you stories, sometimes you're like, "How the hell did I do that in a day?" Like, that was the hardest day I've ever done, but it didn't seem hard. Do you find the same thing when you're out, that people can make all the difference?
Yeah, most definitely. A lot of people, this is something I have not been afforded, which is the opportunity to have, they call them trail families, like families that you make on the trail. So you like hike together, you like eat meals together, like you're always together. I could never have a trail family because I have to stop to recharge my batteries. And that's like always a zero and then a Nero sometimes, or like 2 zeros, depending on what time I get to town, post office being open with my supplies. So I never had the opportunity to join a trail family because they were always ahead of me or I was stopping. Um, on the PCT, my most recent part of the Great Western Loop, on the PCT, I got to hike with a woman who I enjoyed her company, but like you said, like, it was like we would have breakfast together, we'd sometimes meet for lunch, sometimes not, and then we'd have dinner together. And so I always knew that, like, I would just wait for her to come back or wait for her to come or vice versa. And for me, that was like, "Oh, this feels good." So that felt good. And then on the Florida Trail, like, I was gonna quit. I was like, "This is nope. As soon as I get to the next town, I'm over this. I'm gonna quit." Um, but I met a hiker, and the 2 of us started hiking together. But then our personalities were kinda similar, so we would, like, bicker at various points, which was, like, sometimes annoying, but I still appreciated this hiker. But the 2 of us met a 3rd hiker who I met him, and I was like, I'm quitting. And he was like, me too. And I was like, great. All we got to do is make it to the town. So it now became 3 people. So then when we get to town, it was like, all right, we can do one more town before we give up. So it was like, at any point when I was ready to quit, they were like, hey, let's everybody keep going. And I was like, okay. When they were ready to quit, it was like, hey, no, we need to keep going. So that aspect was good. And with these 2 folks, like, it was continuous. Like, we finished the trail together. So it was like, without those two, I don't think that I would have finished it. And I did have one negative experience with in a town where someone was like a truck with very mean intentions, like yelled at me, threw things at me. And I was like, oh, this is not good, because in that town, there was only one campsite. And so I'm like, and there's no woods because this is part of the road walk. I was like, yeah, I probably should not stay here tonight, because like, I'm carrying a backpack. It doesn't take much to think that if I'm carrying a backpack, I would end up at this campsite. So in that one town, I like skipped. I got a ride with someone to skip to go to the next town that had a campsite. Um, but yeah, for the most part, other than that, it was just really good to have those people to connect and to know that, like, okay, if these people did anything to me, I have friends that are coming up behind me. Or, like, I know that I have friends who are waiting for me. And so, either way, if I don't make it, then that's like an accountability piece. That's like a kind of like a safety net. And so, I now understand why trail families are important to people. Um, like, the three of us, like, we might hike again in the future, but I don't know that I would ever have, like, that sort of, like, connection with people because of the trails that I hike.
Yeah, it is. It's also, you mentioned the connection. You make the unlikeliest friends and you end up hanging out with, somebody for a few weeks or a few months. And it's like you'd never be friends with them in real life, but you're experiencing this hard thing together. And I still have people where I'll get the odd email and it's, somebody I talked to 20, 25 years ago, and it'll still be, or they'll still be active on Facebook. One of the
Mhm.
few people who are still posting. It's like, oh, look what they're doing. They're down in Chile. That seems kind of cool.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in people's favorite books. I've started doing this recently. I'm looking for new book recommendations. And I was wondering, are there any books that have influenced you, whether outdoors themed or not, that, you think are really great books people should read?
Yeah, I really like The Adventure Gap, and I'm sorry, I'm gonna slip on names of the people that write them. The Adventure Gap talks a lot about the people of the global majority, so that's brown folks. Like, we make up the majority of the population, and it's like, how can we sustain the planet if the people of the global majority aren't connected to nature? So I really like The Adventure Gap. And in terms of backpacking, I also like Black Faces, White Spaces, which has to do with, like, Black people being outdoors. I don't know what it's like in Canada, but here in the US, you don't see a lot of backpackers of color. So that book really speaks to me. And then my two favorite trail books, and I call them trail books because I read them on the trail, um, is We Are Water, which is my favorite book of all time, and I recommend it to everyone. Like, everyone should read it just because of the way that the story unfolds. It's enlightening, and, like, the character development is great. And I read that on the PCT. And on the Arizona Trail is where I read, oh god, The Great Alone, and that was, like, a beautiful book. And it's gonna sound weird, but there are 2 books with the same title. It's the one that recently came out. It's about a family that moves to Alaska. Like, that to me was, like, I'm on the side of the trail, I just stopped for lunch, and I'm reading the book, and I'm, like, in tears, and this hiker comes and was like, "Oh my god, are you okay?" And I'm like, "This just happened." And then she was like, "When?" And I'm like, "In the book." This woman was like, "What are you talking about?" And I'm like, "No, all of this just happened, and I can't process it all." So, like, for me, those books really speak to me, and I don't know if it's necessarily that I read them on the trail that I love them so much, or if it's, like, because 'cause they're good stories. But I will say that historically, I do not reread books. I got it the first time. If you got your message across, we're good. If you didn't, sorry. But I have read We Are Water every single year since the PCT in 2016. So every year I reread that book. So that speaks to how much I love this book, because I don't reread books, but that's the one exception.
Those are some great recommendations. Crystal, thanks for coming on the show today and sharing your story and kind of the incredible journey you've been on.
Yes. Thank you for having me, Richard. I appreciate it.
And if people want to learn more about you, follow along, how can they do that?
I am on Instagram at Footprints for Change, and that's all words, no numbers. Footprints for Change, or my website, which is footprintsforchange.com.
Wicked. I'll add both of those to the show notes so people can follow along. And with that, thanks everyone for listening to this episode of the 10 Adventures podcast. We'll be back next week to explore the world and hear about more epic adventures. Bye-bye. Start planning your own adventure by visiting us at 10adventures.com and listen to other episodes of the 10 Adventures podcast on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you find your podcasts.